Welcome to Frameworks for Native American Literature. I am Professor Jessica Jones on full-time faculty in the English department at Kent State University at Stark and on summer faculty at the University of Montana Upward Bound program. I'm so excited to be with you for this presentation. The topic of this training is one that's very close to my heart. We'll be looking what are called frameworks for reading Native American literature so that we can sensitively approach Native literature and hopefully come out a bit more informed as active citizens in our world. I wish to tell you that I walk into this space very humbly. This presentation only scratches the surface of very complex layers of Native existence in America. I myself am not Native. I am not a historian. I'm an English teacher who began this work long ago because I love children. Being a lifelong learner is central to my mission. So if you have something to add or correct, I welcome your feedback. And if there's a topic that you'd like to know more about, but I don't have the answers, I'm not afraid to say I don't know and I'll get back to you. So at the end of this talk, I will provide you with ways to reach me. To begin, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I like to say that land acknowledgements are really only a doorway into important conversations. They don't make things okay, but they are a beginning point for talking about ways that we can work towards restorative justice. So we acknowledge that this gathering is taking place on the traditional homelands of the Shawnee, Erie, and Monongahela peoples, as well as dozens of other tribes and nations who were forced to move through this region. We honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the unjust and unresolved historical contexts that continue to affect Indigenous lives. We express our gratitude and respect to the thousands of Native Americans who presently call Northeast Ohio home. We also recognize that no land acknowledgement can ever make right the histories of colonization. Words alone are insufficient. It will take generations of honest effort on the part of all nations and individuals to communicate, negotiate, and realign political, economic, and spiritual structures of injustice and oppression. If we were at the University of Montana, my alma mater and my other institution, at the beginning of any sort of gathering, there would be a blessing, a song or a prayer to begin our time together. Since we can't have that tonight, I wanted to offer up a few images to kind of ground us in a sense of place. The photo on the left is Canal Fulton, Ohio, not far from the campus where I teach at Kent State Stark. In 1785, the Tuscarawas River was the western boundary of the US territory. And on the right, we have an image of arrowheads that my family has dug up in various gardens over several generations. And these would be quite old, the arrowheads we're looking at. I also like to mention early on the topic of place names. It's always important when we're embracing Native literature that if there are place names within the books that we're reading, we learn a little bit more about them. So the place that I'm teaching from today is Ohio, which is an Iroquois Seneca word, meaning it is beautiful, and is typically believed to refer to the Ohio River. The other land that I'd like to acknowledge is the Bitterroot territory in Montana, where I did my graduate work and taught for off and on most of the last decade. And I do have a branch of family that married into the Bitterroot Salish tribe in the 1800s, although I did not know that when I began my scholarship and my journey into Indian education. So when I begin this lecture, I like to think about asking ourselves, through what lens do we see American literature? I was once at a faculty meeting in which a professor held up several books and asked for each one what genre of literature we were looking at. So she held up Emily Dickinson and we all said women's lit. She held up Maya Angelou and we all said African American lit. She held up Harry Potter, we said young adult lit. And then she held up Hemingway and we all just kind of sighed and said, it's just American literature. What that moment did for me was help me perceive how invisible the whiteness and often maleness of the American literary canon, how white and male it often is. And it also validated for me that when we read literature by marginalized groups, we need to establish frameworks for historical context, which is what the Montana Office of Public Instruction has done in their curriculum called Indian Education for All. Montana Indian Education for All posits that 30% of Montana school curricula should be Native, and that to best implement this, educators need what are referred to as the essential understandings, in other words, frameworks, kind of like TP polls, to guide us. The essential understandings outline important contexts, such as the presence of diversity from tribe to tribe, the fact that Native ideologies persist into modern day life, and that many federal policy periods were put into place throughout American history that continue to greatly affect Indian life. So if we were to take a class on Holocaust literature, for example, we would learn about Kristallnacht and the rise of Hitler. In a class on African American literature, we would get important context, such as the Jim Crow era, civil rights, the Harlem Renaissance. So in 1990, public law authorized the White House, a White House conference on Indian education. And since then, institutions like Montana Office of Public Instruction, the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and others have begun compiling resources and designing curriculum that can be used by educators who wish to embrace a fuller picture of America. One that embraces, to use the words of Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie, a multiple rather than a single story narrative. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. This is a quote by Anton Troyer in his book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. And I'll just let you kind of silently read this quote. So this quotation is obviously referring to what we call erasure, the erasing of a culture from the land in which they live, from the history in which they exist, and so forth. This also posits a rationale for why we need Indian education and for why Native literature is an important category of literature to integrate into our classrooms, into our canon, to have on our bookshelves as readers. So this presentation will give a brief overview of the major US federal policy periods that affected Native sovereignty. And when we use the word sovereignty, it's a word that refers to the right and the agency to govern oneself. Often we think, if we're literary people, right, often we think of the term sovereignty in reference to The Wife of Bath, a tale by Chaucer, when her wish, her desire is to have sovereignty over herself during a time period when women did not have much agency over their own lives. And so when we use the term sovereign to refer to nations or groups of people, it refers to that concept of self-empowerment and the ability to act on one's own behalf in a political sense with recognition. We'll also look at contemporary issues, as well as strengths in cultural persistence and progress towards restorative justice, samples from major periods of Native literature, a bulleted list of guidelines for reading Native lit, a list of titles for future reading, and tips on how to be allies and bridge builders. Like all cultures, the oldest stories in Native America are stories of creation. Most indigenous stories are passed down through song and oral tradition. I chose this photograph. Most of the photos in this presentation, actually all of the photos in this presentation are my own, from my own journeys and education workshops and so forth, unless I'm giving credit to some other source. So the things that come from books, you'll see a footnote and so forth. But this photograph is in Blackfeet territory in Glacier National Park. And I like this photograph because it sort of looks timeless to me in the sense that things would not have looked that much different ages ago. So I thought we'd begin with a story about how Creator made the world from the Salish tradition, and Salish and Ponderay in this case. This is from a textbook used in Montana classrooms called Montana Stories of the Land. And we can tell this story right now because there's snow on the ground. Typically in that region, coyote stories are meant to be kept for wintertime. So I'll let you again silently read through this, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the hallmarks of creation stories. So creation stories do typically have some overlapping hallmarks. One is that they often describe the formation of the earth. This is the case across many cultures, not just within Native American literature. Another hallmark of Native creation stories is that they dispense wisdom for relation with all things, the earth and its elements, the creatures and the plants that inhabit it, and the people that one will meet in their life's journey. They also issue responsibilities to those who came before and will follow behind. And they could and still can traditionally take several days to tell in some tribes. When we talk about creation stories from culture to culture, it's important to avoid the word myth in the same way that we would avoid applying the word myth to whatever our own traditions might be, or to the traditions that sort of are considered dominant or mainstream in a culture. So rather than using the word myth, in this presentation, I use the word stories because it's a little bit more open. There's a nice quote here, again, by Anton Troyer. He says, "There are Dakota people who know that Indians came from Spirit Lake. There are Hopi people who know that Indians emerged from the center of the earth in Arizona. There are Christians who know that the story that is printed in the Bible is an accurate description of man's arrival in the world." And obviously, when we relate this back to the slide that we just saw about the Salish creation story, we want to come to that story with as much openness that we might the stories that Anton Troyer refers to here. We'll also note that oftentimes when we study Native literature, it might come in sharp contrast to things that we have been taught elsewhere, other threads of the multiple story narrative. For example, the Clovis model of the land bridge, or archaeological narratives or scientific stories about how things have evolved. And that's normal and very typical. And our goal is just to open up so that we can have a dialogue that incorporates each strand of that, and hold a dialogue that invites in multiple threads. This is a slide from the Onassaguede Cultural Center in Seneca Country in New York. That's actually me there looking at a display for children on Turtle Island. I try as often as possible to, in my travels, go to the cultural centers in Indian country, wherever I am. So a lot of these slides come from from sites like that. The next few are from the Southwest. This is a kiva at Bandelier National Monument. A friend and I had to climb up ladders to get to this sacred spot, about 240 steps. That's my friend Elizabeth climbing up, so that we could visit the cliff dwellings and learn a little bit about that. These are Pueblos Storyteller dolls, also from the Southwest. And what I love about this is that not only is it important, storytelling is important in the human world, but also for animals. And so we see here parent bears telling stories to their babies, snakes telling stories to their babies, turtles, and frog babies as well. On the left in this slide, we have Mesa Verde in Colorado, an ancestral Pueblo location. The people that lived here resided there for over 700 years, starting in around the year 550 AD. And then on the right is Spider Rock at Canyon de Chelly. According to Navajo tradition, Spider Woman lives at Spider Rock, and she was the first to weave the web of the universe. And through this story, she teaches Navajo children how to weave, how to create beauty in their own life, and how to spread what's called the beauty way, a teaching of balance within the mind, body, and soul. This is, I'm not going to play this, but this is a location that you could access further early stories through PBS. It's www.pbs.org/native-America. And they have several different stories there. They've got Choctaw, they have Cherokee, numerous tribes from various regions. A few of them actually also come from Central America. And they're lovely because they're told in the language that the story was born in. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in further study of early stories, to go there. I'm going to skip that. This is a how or why story told by N. Scott Momaday in the Kiowa tradition. I'm not going to take the time to go over this, but he's basically looking at the story of how Devil's Tower was created, and in turn, how the constellations were created. He's a wonderful author, contemporary author who weaves some of the old storytelling into his own poetry and his own memoir. And then, of course, if you're interested, you could look up all kinds of stories in Native astronomy. So the next genre we're going to look at is categories of early Native poetry. And there are several categories, as you can see in the list here. In addition to really diverse categories, we also need to observe that the aesthetics of early Native poetry might be a little bit different from what we're used to in the Eurocentric tradition. European, British, and American poetry had different aesthetics. So within early Native poetry, which was song, essentially, things that were important were repetition, concrete natural images, conciseness of sentence length, frequently reflect a spiritual commitment, even in humorous songs, and they imply a tribal public audience that already understands the context. In sharp contrast to Euro-American poetry, early Native poetry and song avoided personal intellectualizing. And we can see this in this little sample. And of course, this is a translation going back 400 or 500 years. Probably this sounded and looked a lot different in the original language. I could not find a copy of the original, but I think this is worth showing just to kind of dip our feet in the water a little bit, and also open up those dialogues about what translation does and so forth. That's a whole conversation of its own. But what we can see here is that the focus is on nature. It's short, it's concise, there's repetition, and there's an assumed audience, and it would have been sung. Same thing with this Shoshone love song here. Again, imagery from nature, very short, concise lines, repetition, and the refrain in the end is the same as that first stanza. So Up until and long after Europeans arrived in North America, Native peoples have been telling stories, singing songs, writing poetry. This map is a bit out of date. I have some new ones that actually just arrived, but I don't have the digital copies of them. So I'm showing an old map here. If you're interested in really wonderful, accurate new maps, I would suggest going to tribalmaps.com. It's a native-run company, and they make sure they get all of the tribal names correct in the local language and so forth. But the point of this map is to show that long before Columbus arrived, there was a lot going on. And if we invite in those narratives, we learn, for example, that the Iroquois Confederacy was at its height from the year 1570 to 1784. It was comprised of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora tribes. It was one of the oldest living participatory governments, and it did influence colonial governance in America in many ways. So when we look at the colonization period, the narrative that we typically get in US textbooks, museums, public statues, is that Columbus, quote, discovered the Caribbean islands. But these lands were at that time quite full of very sophisticated peoples who were thriving in what is now Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and Puerto Rico. The widely accepted Eurocentric narrative is that Europeans colonized the Americas under a God-given edict called Manifest Destiny, which gave them the divine right to claim any land and dominate any existing peoples, so long as they converted these people to Christianity. But the narrative that we often don't hear is that on the sugar plantations that Columbus built, his Spaniards forced the Taínos Indians to work, often punishing them for minor infractions, lack of production, or attempts at escape. And in the short span of time between his arrival and the year 1505, the Indians were decimated by overwork, disease, murder, and suicide. Europe then turned to Africa for cheap labor, and between 1505 and 1888, it's estimated that 9.5 million Africans were brought over as slaves. This is an excerpt from the History of the Indies. I'm not going to take time to spend on this, but if you are interested in early Native literature, it would be worth looking up some of these documents. I also want to mention here that this borders on a genre of literature that we call witness literature. If you're interested in witness literature, there's a wonderful scholar named Carolyn Forche who talks about what this is and how the thread of the witness is an important one to weave into the tapestry of literature, because it allows us to have yet one more angle on how the story is told. I am a little critical of her because she doesn't focus on Native literature very much at all. But I am sure that in the years to come, we will see people who are and looking at witness literature within that genre. So that's something to watch for. Here we see bits of the narrative at the top as told from Columbus' perspective, and then the narrative below 500 years later from the perspective of President George Bush in 1992. And obviously, these two narratives contrast sharply. And if we were to pull in a narrative from the people who were living in the Caribbean at that time, the indigenous people, it gets really, really complex. So the point as readers and potentially educators of Native American literature is that we want to have multi-perspective narratives. In this slide on the left is the door of my homeroom classroom when I taught on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. We celebrated Native American Heritage Month in November, and we would do very special things at the school so that students could celebrate. In the center is a photograph from a really interesting company called Rethinking Schools out of Minnesota that invites in perspectives from the Native point of view. And then on the right is the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address, which often circulates on social media around Thanksgiving. The story of real Thanksgiving is complicated, and contemporary feelings about it, even in Native America, are really mixed. What we do have some documentation for is worth looking up if you're interested in literature from that time period. And I think it's an important background to have. And and to kind of understand that the federal holiday we have now wasn't even established until Lincoln and afterwards. And it was more as an effort to unify the country following Civil War. I think it's also important to note that President Lincoln in 1862 was responsible for the largest mass hanging in the US, which is kind of an uneasy topic for a lot of people. But again, it's one of those stories that's often erased. And it's an important part of that multiple story narrative. There's a wonderful documentary called Dakota 38 about a commemorative horse ride that the Dakota people take each year to contemporary. This is recent. It just started within the last decade to go back to Mankato and pay homage to the men that were lost there. So the problem with stereotypes is that they are incomplete. They harm the morale of those coming from marginalized cultures, and they can be really difficult to take apart. And on this slide in the left, I have stickers sold in the Acme grocery store right around the corner from my house. And on the right, a bar poster from Minnesota in around 2010. This credit is given to Anton Troyer. It's printed in his book, Everything You Wanted to Know. And I think that it's important to be aware of these stereotypes as readers of Native literature so that we can understand the difficulty of dismantling them within the canon itself even. The story of Manifest Destiny is really woven throughout the perspectives of the colonizers, but the layers of its complexity are often left out of mainstream storytelling. So here in this slide, we get this perspective of New England colonizers as recorded in letters. And oftentimes these threads of narrative are in contrast. For example, epidemiologists might bring additional perspectives. The important thing is to open the dialogue so that we can have a conversation and try to have some sense of a fuller picture. Oops, skipped on. In this slide, I took this of some didactics at the Ganondagan Seneca Art and Cultural Center in New York. And I really like their exhibit because they bring to the surface, they allow the untold stories to emerge. And when we really look for them, the untold stories are everywhere. So here we have a narrative of the 1687 corn raid in which Captain Denonville raided the Seneca villages and burned them to the ground. In about 9 days, 1 million bushels of corn were destroyed. And corn was the mainstay of the Seneca diet at that time. The Europeans believed that they could force the Seneca communities into submission through starvation. And it didn't work. These are photos I took in 2021 of a reconstructed Seneca village on that very site for the purpose of educating youth and holding important ceremonies. So in literature, during this period, we continue to see the tradition of oral storytelling despite oppression. And this allowed Indigenous people to inform and support their ways of knowing, promote their worldviews, their tribal history, pre and post contact with Europeans, and their connections to the land. Themes that we see from this period of literature are themes that continue to emerge through ceremony of storytelling, including life lessons, communal understandings about characters and landscapes, and reclamation of culture following trauma. If you're interested in this period, you might look up Native American testimony, a collection of early narratives. The Lewis and Clark expedition, I'm kind of jumping ahead in time a little bit here, is another narrative that's often only told from the perspective of the colonizer or the explorer. We learn that in schools, we typically learn that in 1803, Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, about 15 states, a chunk of land that spread from Western Montana, that spread to Western Montana, sorry. But we rarely acknowledge that such a purchase was in and of itself a bit of an absurdity. Most of the written story after that, the one in school books, is from the journals and reports of the explorers themselves and not from the viewpoint of Native peoples. So Luckily, over 200 years later, the narratives of some of these individuals are beginning to be woven into the rest of the narrative via the voices of contemporary authors who attempt to give voice, to use a phrase that our Wick Poetry Center here at Kent State University often uses when we are doing community outreach. So here in this slide, we have one of my friends and mentors, Deborah Magpie Erling, and her poetry, The Lost Journals of Sacagawea, in which she kind of reconstructs that missing voice. From the Native perspective, the idea of something like a Louisiana Purchase was unimaginable. Here we have the famous quote from the celebrated Shawnee chief Tecumseh from Ohio, who held his last stand in 1812 before his peoples were displaced to Oklahoma, Kansas, and Canada. A fuller narrative would include the fact that Tecumseh was a multilingual military genius whose strategies are still studied at war colleges abroad, as well as the famous story of the siege at Detroit, in which 600 warriors duped the British by climbing and retreating all day long to create the illusion of hordes of warriors. But we often don't get these stories, which is one of the reasons that Native literature is an important inclusion in the canon. This famous painting illustrates how history is depicted from the perspective of the colonizer, which is being challenged in this painting created 150 years later, which expresses the vision of Native America to regain sovereignty and to heal the land. One of the most damaging narratives of the 19th century is that of Cowboys and Indians, a narrative that reduced both groups to stereotypes, glorifying the cowboy, romanticizing the Indian. Most accounts of battles on the plains in particular favor the perspectives of colonizers like General Sherman and Custer, but leave out the perspectives of Native peoples. And I do like to give a trigger warning before I flip to the next slide, that the next slide is extraordinarily disturbing, and I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to show the image of the massacre of the ghost dancers that wounded me in 1890. So literature often exists as a refusal to be erased. And here we have an excerpt from Leslie Marmon Silko's novel, published in 1981, Almanac of the Dead, a little over 100 years after the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I'll let you silently read this excerpt. So I'm going to jump forward yet again a little bit here and give you a few names of authors you might look up from the 18th and 19th century who offer natives from the Native perspective. On the bottom there, we have Sarah Winnemucca. On the right, we have William Apess. And at the top there is at Kalasa. Many authors during this time were transitioning from oral culture towards written English, due mostly to the forced boarding school era, which I'll talk about in a bit. During this time, writers faced harrowing odds of writing within a political regime that was hostile to their success, and within a tradition that romanticized the Indian as noble savages. Authors often centered on the struggle to find a voice within dominant Eurocentric society, overturning stereotypes and proving that Indians were not going to disappear. Most of the works in these early genres were, or the genres, I should say, of this early time period was often autobiography and novel. Later, sometimes there was a combination of traditional oral storytelling, such as Trickster Tales. This is an excerpt from a quote by Sarah Winnemucca, in which her audience clearly was sympathetic towards her. Often speeches like this were captured by newspaper reporters and the written recording of them includes crowd reactions, which I think is another aspect of that multi-story narrative. Another you might look up is Blackhawk. And during this period of literature, we see a lot of evidence of and reaction to the treaties that were happening and being broken. So as we saw earlier in the painting that depicted westward expansion as, quote, progress, the mainstream narrative typically favors the colonizer perspective. However, when we flip the narrative and we look through the lens of the native perspective, we see a different reality. So this map above, or in front of us, illustrates the systematic eradication of native land that resulted from the 1830 Indian Removal Act. This more recent map from 2005 shows where reservations existed then. There is an even more recent map that I have in my classroom at school, and you can look that up through National Geographic's or the tribalmaps.com that I mentioned earlier. And you can see the numbers at the bottom there. As of current times, there are 571 federally recognized tribes in the US, 229 of which are in Alaska. Here, where I teach in Ohio, no tribes are federally recognized, though they continue to try. And then I'm going to kind of skip past the next two slides. They're more for in-class dialogue. But if you're interested in literature from this time period, you're going to run into some of these terms: tribes, bands, clans, nations, reservations, sovereignty. And as readers, it's important to be informed as to what these definitions actually are. Those are terms that are going to come up when we look at things like the Cherokee Trail of Tears, the Navajo Long Walk. And I also like to say that the facts for some of these historical moments are extremely wily, and part of that is because of how complicated it was. On this map here, we can see that people were pushed in all kinds of directions from their traditional homelands. So things like numbers are kind of hard to nail down for historians. And I wanted to point out as well, an important aspect of this narrative is that often, as the tribes were forced out of their lands, in the process, tribal leaders were smashed together with often leaders from tribes that they used to oppose or consider very separate. And this followed kind of a corporate model that was handed to them by the US government. So we see a lot of this kind of inner conflict emerging in literature from the time. This photo from 1891 shows the bridge that the Bitterroot Salish people had to walk across in order to move to the Flathead Reservation. It was about a 3 days walk north. And this is commemorated each year now, and people return to what is now called St. Mary's Mission. This is actually where a branch of my family settled in the 1860s. The original homelands of most tribes were rich in natural resources: water, fish, game, means of shelter, places to harbor during colder seasons, and so forth. But the people that lived there, when they were forced off of their traditional lands, often lost access to this. The photos I'm showing you right now are originally Blackfeet territory. And as you can see, when the US government surveyed land for reservations, they chose very difficult locations to move the tribes to: places with frigid temperatures, high arid deserts, rocky terrain that were nearly impossible to farm. These photos are both taken in Browning, where the Blackfeet are live now. On this slide, I took these on the Flathead Res a couple years ago, right around Christmas time. And as you can see, it was -19. These slides are from the Rosebud Res. That's me in the lower right, and also me in the photo up top with a bunch of kids. Also kind of rocky terrain, a bit difficult. When attempting to reconstruct the narrative from the Native perspective, it's important to pull in artifacts such as this poster, which was a common way that whites learned about their supposed right to cheap land. The government often rewarded Indians who rejected their tribes by selling them land, which further broke up Indian families. And we see this a lot in the early literature as well as discussion of the disappearance of the buffalo. Many history books claim that the bison kind of died out due to game hunting or even environmental causes, but there's ample documentation to suggest a different narrative in which the US government stood behind the eradication of the buffalo as a way to mutually eradicate Indians. The story that's often glorified is that of the Wild West, told from the perspective of the colonizer. These photos evidence an important thread in the narrative of bison survival. I used to live right across not right across the road. The town I lived in was across the road from the National Bison Range here just outside of St. Ignatius. So the view you're looking at here is on top of the mountain. And then in this slide, this is the view looking down into the mountain. And I lived just outside of that town up in the hills there. Another photo of town. When we look at multiple story narratives from this time, we'll witness a very complicated relationship between the tribes and the Christian religion. A very strong missionary presence. The St. Ignatius mission was founded in 1891. This one is of St. Mary's mission in the Bitterroot Valley. And the following segment of the presentation is one of the most harrowing, and until recently, one of the most silenced chapters of the history of Native experience, and that would be the boarding school era. So in 1879, General Henry Richard Pratt established the first forced boarding school for Indians in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man," and the movement basically forced the removal of children and young adults from their families, from their tribes as young as 5 years old. And they were taken states and states away in some cases. In 1889, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wrote, quote, "This education policy is based on the well-known inferiority of the great mass of Indians in religion, intelligence, morals, and home life." There were about 25 boarding schools at that time, and each year they enrolled about 20,000 new students. Today, about 4 Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools are still in existence with reformed policies. And in Canada, residential schools continued well into the 1970s. The Merriam Report, an important investigation into the health of these schools, revealed that trachoma and other diseases were prevalent due to crowded and unclean living spaces. Many students at Carlisle, in addition, spent half their day digging ditches or working in fields, doing manual labor, and only part of the day actually at work, learning in the classroom. This is a quote before and after photo of a young man at Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania. These are photos from the Carlisle Indian School grounds. My sister and I went to visit this past spring. That's me in front of the girls' dormitory. On the right is the guardhouse, and on the bottom left is the gazebo, which functioned as kind of a panoptic where General Pratt would watch the students and try to catch anyone who escaped, sort of oversee them in a manner very, very similar to the panoptic at Auschwitz and other concentration camps. Of course, it is a multiple story narrative as things go. So there are complicated and often contrasting views of the boarding schools because some students did have good experiences or felt that it allowed them to have greater opportunities. In the slide here, we have Jim Thorpe, a Fox Sack from Oklahoma, a track star, Olympian, pro ball player. Although it is worth noting that many American Indian athletes were denied awards and medals due to their race. These are some of the archives at the Cumberland Historical Society in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And they allow us to piece together narratives from yearbooks, diaries, drawings, letters. The photo that I'm holding in the top right there is propaganda, not dissimilar to the propaganda used at concentration camps in which children were dressed nicely. They were kind of told to pose and look happy and so forth. The same thing was being done at Carlisle. In the bottom right there, I'm going through some of the archives. When my sister and I were there, they were doing disinterment, returning a young boy to the tribe 140 years later. I'll just kind of let you silently read this. So while my sister and I were there, they were returning the little ancestors to their descendants at Rosebud. This shows the map of where these boarding schools were in 1892. Here's a list. If you're interested in this era, there are multiple threads to the narrative, and there's a plethora of literature out there about it, more and more each year. So I'm going to offer that you could take a brief break right now and hit pause on the video to do what I refer to as an ink shed, kind of to jot down any thoughts, revelations, questions you have at this point. So feel free to pause that. And when you're ready, you can hit play again. So the first half of our presentation has given a brief overview of important dates in Native American history according to the Indian Education for All Essential Understandings. And these can serve as those frameworks or kind of backbone to the structure of Native literature. It's estimated that only about I'll reverse that about 87% of schools in America teach nothing about anything regarding Native America after the year 1900. So in the next bit of time here, we're going to get a brief overview of the narrative threads from 1900 to now, much of which is still left out of mainstream US school curriculum and literature. For example, Indigenous women and women's rights. Despite all of the attempts of the US government to eradicate Native peoples for 400 years, Native peoples continue to not only survive, but contribute to their own societies and to the greater landscape of America. So here we see the influence of Haudenosaunee women from on the foremothers of women's rights. If you ever get the chance, it's really worth going up to the Women's Rights National Park in Seneca Falls, New York. This is great. It would be a great field trip for students of literature from this time period to kind of learn about the influence of Native women on the white women there who were striving for women's rights in America. In 1928, the US government conducted the Miriam Report, which I mentioned earlier, which revealed the social and economic hardships of Indian life. And there was briefly instated an attempt to restore tribal self-governance. There was kind of an Indian New Deal between 1934 and 1958. And during this time, the tribes attempted to rebuild self-sufficiency, self-sovereignty, self-government. But at that same time, and you'll see if you read literature from these years, there were still things going on to eradicate tribal sovereignty, such as the Navajo sheep slaughter, other things, sterilization, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then we kind of jump forward again in time towards the termination period. Because without sovereignty, the tribes were financially dependent upon the US government. And so there was really a lot of difficulty trying to sustain themselves and become independent overnight. Many never recovered and therefore lost federally recognized tribal status. So this again kind of damaged the trust between the tribes and the US government. These next few slides, I'm just going to kind of let you look at them and absorb a little bit. They're difficult. So again, I kind of issue a trigger warning here. If we take the legal definition of genocide developed by the United Nations in 1948 and we look through this list, we can see that what we've been discussing qualifies. Reiterated here in very similar terms. This brings us to the self-determination period from 1968 to the present, which is really important to understand if we're studying modern and contemporary Native literature. And you see a few kind of big moments there in the unfolding. In 1990, we also had the well, I guess it's at the bottom there, the Protection Act for Burial Grounds and Archaeological Sites. And yet there is still continued religious persecution, harassment for things like sweat lodges, not allowing students to smudge in dormitories at state colleges, things like that. Despite all this, like we've seen, there's a persistence in the arts and a wonderful renaissance from the 1960s to 70s within Native communities. And at this time, we see authors attempting a reclamation of heritage through the arts, rediscovering early texts by Indigenous authors. We see in their literature how compelled they are to write about oral tradition, ceremony, ritual, and the novels and poetry of authors from these two decades often address themes of returning home, going back to the res, the dilemma and societal treatment of mixed blood identities, the heartbreak and loss of sacred lands, which we've seen, as well as that cyclical trauma of the boarding school era. Authors to look up from this time period might be N. Scott Momaday, Leslie Marmon Silko, Gerald Visner, James Welch, Joy Harjo, Simon Ortiz, Louise Erdrich, and so forth. There's a rise of activism, public art, and the desire for urban Indians to return home both geographically and in ideology. This is a poem by Scott Momaday. If you get the chance to listen to him read it, there are recordings floating around online. He has just a wonderful reading voice. I would highly recommend Momaday's work, as well as, of course, our National Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. This is her famous Eagle poem. You can find a video of it in which she plays flute and reads her piece. And during the literature from all of the authors I just mentioned, we'll see evidence of the fight for sovereignty, the fight for land and water rights, a desire to reclaim native languages and include signage on the res, rights for or protection of indigenous species, both in the plant world and in the animal world, in places that are considered checkerboard res, meaning that white and indigenous families live side by side as the result of all of those broken treaties. Oftentimes in Native literature, we see evidence of what's called clouded title, in which there's no way to prove rightful ownership of a parcel of land, usually because that land was taken from a Native family illegally, and therefore the property value has been decreased. That's me paddleboarding, not far from where I lived in Montana. These are all from the town where I lived. An assimilation of culture where you see kind of side by side evidence of culture being taught to children, ceremonies happening throughout the year, and so forth. These are all just to kind of give you a little glimpse into Indian country. This slide is kind of important. This is a success story. This is the first dam in the US to be fully tribally owned, Salish Kootenai Dam. That's me with my 6th grade students up at the top there, and then with some of the high school students from the Upward Bound program in the bottom slides. But it is a struggle. If you get the chance to go to Anasakwede Cultural Center, you'll learn about the Kinser Dam, which was just absolutely devastating to the people on the Allegheny Reservation. And of course, pipelines also continue to threaten native lands, as well as the rise of forest fires. When we look at literature, it's important to remember that the stories we're reading are stories that were originally told in indigenous languages. In 1491, it's estimated that there were about 2,300 tribal languages spoken in North and South America. As of today, there's only about 650, and it's expected that by 2051, there will only be 20 tribal languages remaining in the US as elders pass on. One hopeful story is Hawaii, where language immersion schools have increased in usage from less than 1,000 speakers to around 20,000, including some non-native learners. And so it shows that this is possible, but it's quite difficult. When we're reading Native literature, we have to remember that language is a cornerstone of identity. In indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous languages allow natives to be recognizable to ancestors. They're a defining feature of nationhood. They carry unique tribal worldviews. They're made up of morphemes that are known by the speakers. So for example, words have deeper meanings and stories and messages and even puns to those who grew up in these places that have special stories assigned to place names. So often a place name and therefore a story is intended to relay wisdom and instructions for how to live, such as in the Western Apache. There's a wonderful book called Wisdom Sits in Places that I'll show you a slide of shortly here. So as we approach Native literature, it's important to remember that all tribes are different, all reservations are different. As such, education opportunities are different. Ways of delivering information is different. These are just a few slides from the school where I taught. But all face the challenge of overcoming stereotypes. And we see this in literature as well. And I think one of the ways that literature is most powerful is its ability to tell those multiple story narratives that overcome the flattening out of humanity. This is a wonderful quote from Anton Troyer that says, "Everyone is swallowing a spoonful of racism each time we see a native mascot. And that spoonful dehumanizes all of us, regardless of our race or cultural background." I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to a few other important issues for contemporary Native literature. One of them is overcoming trauma. Another is the murdered and missing women Indigenous, murdered and missing Indigenous women's phenomenon. These are things that you'll want to definitely look up if you're reading contemporary literature, because there's going to be references to these. And there are some Native authors who are specifically focusing on the subject and kind of giving voice. One of them is Kim Shuck. You can look up her work put out by Foothills Press. She does poetry. Another important thing to think about as we approach contemporary literature is the comparison of Native genocide to the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust. And author Sherman Alexie has approached this in a cycle of poetry he wrote about Dachau. And yet, despite this, in literature, it's also important that we acknowledge the darkness and also acknowledge the light in a spirit of survivance, which is a wonderful word from the Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner. And it's not, you can't really pin down this term, but it suggests an ability to still celebrate despite difficulty and trauma, and a sense of surviving despite it all. So in literature, we are also going to see a lot of evidence of strength and endurance, especially through stories of the land, such as the story of the Bitterroot in the Salish tradition, or that title I mentioned a moment ago, the idea of place names and storytellings that have sustained cultures century to century. This is a wonderful example. This is a quote from Keith Batho's Wisdom Sits in Places, and I'll let you silently read that quote. Within literature, Native humor is also important, and we see this time after time, poetry, novels, and so forth, genre to genre. Vine Deloria has written about this. This book on the left-hand side there is a fun one to look up. We also see it in cartoon literature and so forth. This is Ricardo Cate from the Kiowa Pueblo in the Southwest. This is a photo I took in Indian country when I was on my way through Southeast Montana. And then currently we have a wonderful explosion of talent on the in the entertainment industry. I'm a big fan of Reservation Dogs. It's a new one. There's also Rutherford Falls, directors like Taika Waititi, who's he's not Native American, but he's Indigenous from New Zealand, Australia region, and really kind of tying things together with Indigenous communities in a global sense and celebrating survivance and humor and all of the good things that we see in Native literature. Also in Native literature, we see evidence of tradition coming through in celebrations, things like powwows, rodeos, food, dance. These are from the Arlee powwow in Montana. This is from Browning Indian days. These are photos from the Southwest, and they're taken from brochures. I, of course, would never take photographs at something like an important Kachina dance. But there on the bottom right hand is me and my sister in one of the kivas after an important dance that we got to witness. I like to always remind readers and students and listeners that the kind of mantra in Indian country is quote, "We're still here," because it contrasts the narrative of the mainstream, which is that Indians are a thing of the past. And all of the photos that I'm showing you right now have been taken within the last 5 years in my education and in my research, cultural heritage centers across the country. And this kind of brings us to our poet laureate, Joy Harjo, because there has been a wonderful rise to attention in the media. We still need more, as women in particular take seats in government. And here she is. This is Poet Laureate Joy Harjo with Deb Holland. I have a brief slide here that I'm not going to spend time on, but it just kind of recaps what we just talked about kind of over the last 100 years. And that lands us with contemporary Native literature. So it's really important that we think about the fact that, like any literature, Native literature and contemporary Native literature is diverse. It's diverse in genres, styles, subjects, languages, heritage, politics, perspectives on history, and contributions to an ever-evolving body of stories, poems, and songs. This is a map that I use in my classroom with interactive arrows that you can move around to kind of show how far and wide Indigenous authors are acting and contributing within the US. This is a friend and writer from Montana. She has a new name now, it's Jennifer Finley. These are a few titles by Joy Harjo if you're interested in looking her up. And if you go on to poetryfoundation.org and you go to Indigenous poetry, you'll find lots and lots of examples. Authors like Gladys Cardiff, Lucy Tapahanso. These are all Lucy. She's one of my favorites. That's her. She's got videos. And other authors. So a few slides here before we conclude, just to give you a sense of what's out there. This is poetry by some of the big names going back a few decades. There's Lucy Tapahanso, Jimmy Santiago Baca, James Welch, Joy Harjo, and Scott Momaday, Simon Ortiz. I mentioned Kim Shuk, a contemporary writer, and this is a wonderful collection. All kinds of women writers from Native communities across North America. If you're interested in fiction, we've got James Welch up here with Fool's Crow, Leslie Marmon Silko, numerous titles for both of those authors, same with Louise Erdrich, a new contemporary author, Tommy Orange, Sherman Alexie, and then this one on the left, it's actually not a Native author, which I don't usually encourage, but her husband has relatives who were and who survived the boarding school era, and so she used family documents to write a lyric novel in the young adult genre about two young girls in the boarding schools. Some other further reading: philosophy and Indigenous ways of knowing, Vine Deloria, Daniel Wildcat. This is a collection put together by Wilma Mankiller with lots of voices by women across the country. And Linda Hogan, David Moore at University of Montana. He's one of my mentors. He himself is white, but he has done incredible work within Native literature and theory towards sovereignty and important recognition. It's also important, especially when teaching children, to think about books to avoid. These are two titles I would definitely tell teachers and parents to avoid giving their children because of the stereotypes they endorse. They're white authors writing in first-person narratives from a Native perspective, which is really not a good thing to do. Instead, I would encourage audience members, readers, teachers, family members to go to websites like this that offer resources for responsible reading from tribal perspectives, lists of ancestor-improved intertribal stories for kids, and so forth. And then I would offer, finally, just a few guidelines for reading Indigenous literature. We always want to realize that Indigenous cultures are land-based. Nature, place, religion, and language are often inseparable. We also need to, as I pointed out in the presentation, realize that many Indigenous groups have been forced out of their lands, which continues to cause immense losses in every aspect of Indigenous life. We want to accept that many Indigenous cultures are primarily oral, meaning that stories, verse, song, and wisdom and ways of knowing are passed from one generation to the next with no written component. Understand also that due to the complicated nature of colonialism and the boarding schools, there can be deep distrust of the written word. Be aware that commonly accepted standards in European and Caucasian American canons may not apply. Conduct research to explore the expectations and aesthetics within the given tribe or region of the literature you're studying. Avoid sweeping generalizations. No one author in any tradition can be expected to represent his or her culture, race, or religion or gender perspective, linguistic style, etc. Be tribally specific. North America has hundreds of diverse, highly unique Indigenous tribes. Distinct languages, religion, and culture are very much alive today. So we want to be respectful of these differences and not speak of Indigenous life as a past event. We also have to understand that much Indigenous culture has been erased, oppressed, illegalized, marginalized, stereotyped, appropriated, tokenized, romanticized, mysticized throughout history. These erasures permeate American understandings of, quote, the Indian, and manifest in books, film, art, fashion, sports, and psychology, even New Age spiritual movements, and sometimes even in academia. So the more alert and mindful we can be, the more we can open that conversation. We want to avoid buying literature written from first-person perspective of non-Indigenous authors. I kind of mentioned that a moment ago. Familiarize ourselves with the basic outline of federal policies. That's those essential understandings from the beginning of the slideshow. And then be prepared for Indigenous perspectives in literature to contrast sharply with the perspectives commonly told by mainstream history and the more mainstream canon of literature. And then lastly, embrace the wideness of Indigenous literature and its many subgenres. Young voices continue to contribute. Fresh perspectives and older voices continue to gain presence within the ever-widening American canon. Finally, kind of get to know the history and culture of your own region. These are all photographs I've taken while out hiking, literally out my back door in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. There's history all around us. And it's also worth trying to learn a few words in the language of the region that you live in. So this is actually Bitterroot Salish from when I lived in Montana. Lempsh means thank you. And finally, I'll just kind of flash quickly through the Works Cited. Oops, I skipped one. And if you'd like to reach out to me, you can reach me at jjones1@kent.edu. I'm also on Instagram at Jessica Jones Poetry. I write my own poetry in addition to being a teacher. And I have an educator website at Digication. It's a Digication portfolio. You can just Google Jessica Jones Portfolio Digication and I will pop up. So I hope to hear from some of you. Feel free to reach out with any questions, corrections, thoughts that you have. Again, I walk into this very, very humbly with the hopes of always opening up the literary canon towards including cultures and peoples whose voices have not been heard. So thank you for being with me today, and I wish you the best. Happy reading.